Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the English Globe. It's always a great pleasure to have you here with us. Whether you are a student, a teacher, or simply an English learner who enjoys understanding the world through simple and clear stories, this podcast is made especially for you. Today, we have another interesting and educational topic that connects language learning with real-world events that shape our lives.
Yes, welcome everyone. We are truly happy that you decided to spend your time with us. In every episode of the English Globe, our goal is not just to help you improve your English, but also to help you understand global issues that are changing the way our world works. Today's topic is about two of the world's most powerful leaders, Donald Trump, the former President of the United States, and Xi Jinping, the President of China, and how their relationship has influenced global trade.
That's right, Julia. The title of today's episode is Trump-Xi and the Future of U.S.-China Trade Relations. Now, some of our listeners might be wondering why we are talking about this topic in an English learning podcast. The reason is simple. Learning English is not only about grammar and vocabulary, it's also about understanding how people communicate in the real world, how countries cooperate or compete, and how global events are described in English.
Exactly. When you listen to topics like this, you learn useful international words such as trade, negotiation, tariff, economy, cooperation, and diplomacy. You also learn how English is used in global discussions. This is very helpful for students who dream of studying abroad, working in international companies, or simply improving their listening and speaking skills.
Before we start today's deep discussion, we would love to kindly ask all our dear listeners to take a moment and like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The English Globe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next educational episodes. Your support really helps our small community grow and reach more English learners around the world.
And we'd also love to know more about you. Please tell us in the comments section where you are listening from. Maybe you're joining from India, the Philippines, Brazil, Afghanistan, or somewhere in Africa or Europe. We read every single comment, and it's always amazing to see how our podcast connects learners from every part of the world. So please share your country and your opinion about today's topic. We always enjoy hearing your thoughts.
Now let's start by setting the scene. When we talk about U.S.-China trade relations, we are talking about one of the most important economic relationships in the modern world. The United States and China are the two largest economies on the planet. Almost every product you use, from your smartphone to your clothes, from cars to electronic parts, is somehow connected to trade between these two nations.
That's true, Adam. The connection between the US and China is not only about money. It's also about ideas, technology, education, and political influence. When these two countries cooperate, the world economy grows faster. But when they disagree or compete, it can affect millions of people around the globe. Prices can rise, jobs can be lost, and even small businesses in other countries can feel the change. That's why understanding their relationship is so important.
Yes. And today we'll look at how this relationship developed, what changed during Donald Trump's presidency, how President Xi Jinping responded, and what it could mean for the future of international trade. But don't worry, we will explain everything in simple English, step by step, so that every learner can understand both the language and the ideas clearly.
Let's first talk about why this topic became so famous. When Donald Trump became president in 2017, he started to talk about something called the trade deficit. That means when a country imports more goods than it exports. Trump believed that the United States was losing money to China because it was buying too many Chinese products and selling fewer American goods in return. This idea became the center of his trade policy.
Exactly, Julia. And to deal with that, Trump introduced new tariffs, which are extra taxes placed on products imported from China. His goal was to make American products more competitive and reduce the trade imbalance. But this also started what many people called a trade war, because China answered with its own tariffs on U.S. goods. This situation made the world pay close attention to the future of US-China relations.
For English learners, this topic is very useful because it helps you learn about international communication, political vocabulary, and economic expressions. It also helps you practice understanding long discussions in English, something that's very helpful if you are preparing for exams like IELTS or TOEFL, or if you just want to speak English more naturally in global conversations.
You're absolutely right. And remember, as we go through this podcast, don't just listen. Try to repeat new words after us, think about their meaning, and maybe even write them down in your notebook. Listening to world topics in English is one of the best ways to grow your vocabulary and improve your listening comprehension at the same time.
Today's discussion will also show how two different leadership styles, Trump's focus on America's national interests and Xi Jinping's focus on China's long-term growth, created both conflict and negotiation. We will explore how their decisions shaped not only trade, but also the global economy, technology industries, and even how other countries make economic choices.
That's what makes today's episode special. It's not just about politics or business. It's about how communication, leadership, and decision-making affect the entire world. And since we explain everything using easy and educational English, it's a perfect chance for learners to understand a complex topic in a simple and enjoyable way.
So, dear listeners, make sure you stay with us until the end of this podcast. You'll not only understand the history and the future of US-China trade relations, but you'll also learn many new words and expressions that will make your English sound more international and informed.
Thank you again for joining us at the English Globe. Let's begin our journey through one of the most fascinating economic stories of the modern era, the trade relationship between Donald Trump's America and Xi Jinping's China. We'll start by understanding the meaning of trade and why it's such a key part of our world today. Before we go deeper into the story of Trump and Xi, it's very important that we understand one simple question. What is trade? When we say trade, we mean the exchange of goods and services between people, businesses, or countries. For example, if one country sells cars to another, that's trade. If another country sells clothes, phones, or food in return, that's also trade. It's the process that connects countries together and allows everyone to get what they need or want.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Trade is not something new. It has existed for thousands of years. Long ago, people used to exchange things directly. Maybe some rice for salt or some cloth for fruits. That was called barter trade. But as societies grew and money was invented, trade became more complex. Countries started producing goods that they were good at making and buying other goods that were cheaper or easier to get from abroad. This simple idea is what makes international trade so important today.
And when we talk about international trade, there are two main words that students should remember: exports and imports. An export is when a country sells something to another country. For example, China exports many products like electronics, clothing, and toys to the United States. An import is when a country buys something from another nation. The United States imports a lot of goods from China because they are affordable and produced on a large scale.
That's right. And the difference between what a country exports and what it imports is called the trade balance. If a country exports more than it imports, it has a trade surplus. If it imports more than it exports, it has a trade deficit. During Donald Trump's presidency, the US had a large trade deficit with China. That means it was buying far more Chinese goods than it was selling to China. This became a major issue that Trump wanted to change.
Exactly. But trade isn't only about numbers. It's also about relationships between nations. For example, when two countries trade, they also build connections in business, education, and technology. Companies from different parts of the world work together, share ideas, and even invest in each other's countries. Trade creates jobs, builds trust, and sometimes even helps countries avoid conflict because they depend on each other economically.
However, trade can also lead to tension when one country feels that the system is unfair. Some people might believe that their country is losing jobs because companies move their factories to places where production is cheaper. Others might say that imported goods hurt local businesses. That's why trade is not only an economic topic, it's also a political and emotional one. It affects the lives of millions of people, and that's exactly what made the US-China situation so serious.
Let's take an example to make this clearer. Imagine you are living in America and you buy a new smartphone. That phone was probably designed in California but made in China. Why? Because Chinese factories can produce electronics faster and at a lower cost. Now, China earns money from producing the phone, and the US earns money from selling and designing it. Both countries benefit, but at the same time, the US loses some manufacturing jobs because those factories are in another country.
And that's where the idea of tariffs comes in. A tariff is a special tax placed on imported goods. For example, if a Chinese company sells a product to America and there's a 25% tariff, that means the price of the product will increase when it enters the US. The goal of tariffs is usually to protect local industries, so that people buy more American-made goods instead of foreign ones. But tariffs can also cause prices to rise for consumers, making everyday products more expensive.
Yes, and that's why trade policies are so complicated. Governments have to find a balance between protecting their local industries and keeping products affordable for citizens. When Donald Trump became president, he believed that high tariffs on Chinese goods would help American workers. But the situation was not so simple, because many American companies depend on parts and materials that come from China. So the tariffs affected not just Chinese companies, but also American ones.
This is one of the most important lessons for English learners. When you read or listen to news about trade, it's important to look at both sides. Trade is not about one country winning and another losing. It's about cooperation and competition at the same time. Countries need each other because no nation can produce everything it needs. For example, the US needs rare materials from other countries, and China needs technology and innovation from foreign markets. That's what keeps global trade alive.
I really like that point, and if you think about it, trade also teaches us something about communication. Just like countries negotiate trade deals, people also need to communicate and understand each other to solve problems. That's one of the reasons we talk about these topics here at the English Globe. When you learn about global trade in English, you're not only improving your language, you're also learning how the world connects through ideas, dialogue, and cooperation.
Exactly, Adam. And for many of our listeners, this might be the first time hearing about concepts like tariffs, trade deficit, or imports and exports. Don't worry if these words sound new. Throughout this podcast, we'll repeat and explain them in different ways so you can understand their meaning deeply. The more you hear these words, the more comfortable you'll become using them when you talk or write in English about global topics.
Let's also not forget how technology has changed trade. Today, trading goods is not just about ships, ports, and containers. It's also about digital products, data, software, and online services. American and Chinese companies compete strongly in areas like artificial intelligence, social media, and e-commerce. So, when we say trade, it's not only about physical goods, it's also about the digital economy, which is growing faster every year.
Yes, and that's another reason why US-China relations are so significant. Both countries are leaders in global technology. They influence the way people shop, communicate, and even think about privacy and innovation. The trade relationship is part of a much bigger story about who leads the future of technology and business. And that's something we will explore later in this podcast as we move toward understanding how the trade war began and what it means for the world.
Before we end this part, let's quickly review the new vocabulary we learned today. Trade means exchanging goods or services. Exports are what a country sells abroad, and imports are what it buys from others. Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. A trade deficit happens when imports are higher than exports, and a trade surplus is the opposite. All of these words will help you understand the next parts of our discussion much more clearly.
That's a great summary, Adam. And dear listeners, as you continue listening, try to remember these words and practice saying them aloud. You can even pause the podcast, repeat the new words, and make your own simple sentences. For example, China exports electronics, or the US imports many goods. Simple sentences like these help you remember vocabulary faster and make your English stronger every day.
Very true, Julia. So now that we understand what trade really means and why it's so important for the world economy, it's time to look back at how the US and China started building their trade relationship in the first place. The next part of our story will take us back several decades, to the time when both countries decided to open their doors to each other and begin one of the most important economic partnerships in modern history.
Yes, that's where the real story begins. The story of cooperation, competition, and change. In the next part of our podcast, we'll explore how US-China trade relations began, how both countries benefited from it, and what led to the first signs of tension. It's a fascinating journey through history, economy, and language. And it will help you understand how today's trade issues were built over time.
Now that we understand what trade really means, let's go back in time and see how the trade relationship between the United States and China began. It's an incredible story that shows how two very different countries slowly opened their doors to each other and became deeply connected through economics. To understand this, we need to travel to the late 20th century, a time of change, reform, and new opportunities for both nations.
Yes, that's right, Adam. In the 1970s, China was a very different country from what we know today. It was mostly closed to the outside world with a centrally planned economy, meaning the government controlled almost everything, from what was produced to how it was sold. But everything started to change under a leader named Deng Xiaoping, who introduced economic reforms known as reform and opening up. His idea was simple but powerful. China should open its economy to the world, attract foreign investment, and learn from global business practices.
That decision completely changed China's future. By opening up its economy, China began to allow foreign companies to build factories, hire workers, and trade goods. American companies saw this as an opportunity because labor and production costs in China were much lower than in the United States. So, many U.S. businesses started producing goods in China and then selling them around the world. This was the beginning of a partnership that would later become one of the largest trade connections in human history.
Exactly. And it wasn't only about business, it was also about politics and diplomacy. In 1979, the United States and China officially established diplomatic relations, meaning they agreed to recognize each other as formal partners. This was a huge moment, not just for trade, but for global politics. After years of political distance, the two nations decided to communicate, cooperate, and learn from one another. That step helped open the door for millions of products, investments, and ideas to move between the two countries.
From that moment, trade between the U.S. and China started to grow rapidly. American companies like Apple, Nike, and General Motors began to depend on Chinese factories for production. At the same time, Chinese businesses gained access to international markets and modern technology. For many years, this trade connection helped both countries grow stronger. China became the world's largest manufacturer, and the U.S. enjoyed cheap, high-quality products that supported its consumer economy.
And it's interesting to see how much both sides benefited. China's economy started to grow at an incredible speed. In just a few decades, hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens were lifted out of poverty. The country built new cities, highways, and industries, becoming one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. For the United States, American consumers enjoyed lower prices, and many companies increased their profits by producing goods in China at lower costs.
Yes. But while this cooperation was beneficial, it also created some challenges. As trade between the two nations increased, many American workers started to worry that their jobs were being moved overseas. Some factories in the U.S. closed because it was cheaper to produce the same goods in China. This became a major topic of debate. Some people argued that globalization made the world richer, while others felt it made some communities poorer. That tension stayed under the surface for many years until it became a political issue.
That's a very important point, Adam. Globalization, the process of connecting economies, cultures, and technologies around the world, is often seen as both a gift and a challenge. On one hand, it brings countries closer and creates opportunities for trade and cooperation. On the other hand, it can cause inequality if some industries lose out while others grow. For China and the United States, globalization was the bridge that connected them, but it also became the reason for future conflict.
Let's not forget the role of China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001. That was another key moment in the U.S.-China relationship. When China joined the WTO, it became officially part of the global trading system. This meant that China had to follow international trade rules, and other countries, including the U.S., could trade more freely with China. Many economists at that time believed that this would help China modernize and become a more open economy. And for a while, it really worked.
Yes, China's membership in the WTO allowed it to expand its exports massively. Factories across China started producing everything from electronics and clothing to toys and furniture for global markets. American retailers filled their stores with Chinese products, and prices remained low for consumers. It was a time when trade seemed to be a win-win situation. The U.S. economy benefited from cheap imports, and China benefited from strong export growth. Both sides looked successful, and the world admired their economic interdependence.
But as the years went on, the story started to change. While American consumers enjoyed low prices, many U.S. industries found it harder to compete. Manufacturing jobs declined, and people began to question whether the U.S. had become too dependent on Chinese goods. Meanwhile, China's economy kept growing stronger and more advanced. It started investing heavily in technology, infrastructure, and innovation. The balance of power between the two nations was slowly shifting, and that made some leaders in Washington concerned.
And those concerns became louder in the 2010s. Many American politicians started saying that China was not playing fair, that it was using unfair trade practices like providing government support to its companies, keeping its currency value low to make exports cheaper, and sometimes not protecting intellectual property, meaning that inventions or ideas from foreign companies were copied without full permission. These issues created tension long before Donald Trump became president.
That's right, Julia. By the time Trump entered office in 2017, many Americans already believed that something had to change. They felt that the U.S. had been too patient for too long, and that the trade system between the two countries needed to be rebalanced. Trump turned these ideas into his campaign message, promising to put America first and to challenge China on trade issues. That was the beginning of a new and more confrontational phase in U.S.-China relations, one that we often call the trade war.
Yes, and we'll soon explore that part of the story in detail. But before we move to the period of tension, it's important to appreciate how cooperation between the two countries shaped the world. Without the growth of U.S.-China trade, global products would look very different today. Imagine how many devices, clothes, or machines you use that were made possible through this partnership. It's one of the greatest examples of how economic cooperation can connect billions of people across the planet.
I completely agree. The early years of U.S.-China trade show how collaboration can transform nations. It helped China rise from poverty to prosperity and allowed the U.S. to build a global economy full of affordable products. But it also reminds us that every partnership comes with challenges, especially when both sides want to protect their own interests. And those challenges are exactly what led to the trade conflict we'll discuss in the next part of this podcast.
Yes, dear listeners, in the next section, we'll look closely at how the peaceful cooperation between the US and China began to face tension. We'll discuss the rise of trade disputes, the political debates, and how both countries started to question each other's economic policies. This is where the relationship that once seemed stable started to become uncertain, and where the modern trade war began to take shape.
Now that we understand how the U.S.-China trade relationship began, let's move to the time when things started to become complicated. For several decades, both countries worked together, and the trade relationship kept growing. But underneath that growth, small cracks began to appear, disagreements, suspicions, and concerns about fairness. These cracks slowly became bigger, and eventually, they turned into open tension between the world's two biggest economies.
Yes, Adam, and the word tension is very important here. It means pressure or stress between two sides, not a war or conflict with weapons, but a strong disagreement that affects communication and cooperation. In the case of the US and China, this tension came mostly from trade and technology. Both countries wanted to protect their own industries and make sure they weren't losing too much to the other. But as both economies grew stronger, competition became more intense.
One of the biggest issues was the trade deficit we mentioned earlier. The United States was importing far more goods from China than it was exporting. By the mid-2000s, the trade deficit had grown to hundreds of billions of dollars every year. Many American workers and politicians believed this was unfair. They said that China's economic policies made it easier for Chinese products to dominate global markets, while U.S. industries struggled to compete.
Exactly. And another major concern was something called intellectual property rights. These rights protect inventions, designs, and creative ideas. Many US companies claimed that their technologies or product ideas were being copied by Chinese companies without proper permission or payment. This became a serious issue because innovation, especially in technology, is one of America's strongest industries. When companies felt their ideas were not being protected, it created frustration and mistrust.
And we can't forget about currency policy, which also became a source of disagreement. For years, U.S. officials accused China of keeping its currency, the yuan, weaker than the U.S. dollar to make Chinese exports cheaper and more attractive to global buyers. This meant that American products became more expensive in comparison, making it harder for U.S. companies to sell abroad. Whether or not that was true, it added another layer of complexity to the trade relationship.
That's right, Adam. And by the time Donald Trump came into office in 2017, many of these frustrations had been building for years. Trump campaigned on a promise to bring back American manufacturing jobs and reduce the trade deficit with China. He believed that China had been taking advantage of the US through unfair trade practices. This message resonated with many American voters who felt left behind by globalization and factory closures. Trump's direct style and his focus on America first made trade a top priority from the very beginning of his presidency.
Yes, and once he became president, Trump began to act quickly. He launched several investigations into Chinese trade practices and announced tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. A tariff, as we explained earlier, is a tax on imported products. His goal was to make Chinese goods more expensive in the U.S. market, so people would buy more American-made products instead. But this move also triggered a strong reaction from China, and that's when the situation started to escalate.
China responded by placing its own tariffs on American goods, especially agricultural products like soybeans, corn, and meat. This affected many American farmers who relied heavily on selling their crops to China. In some areas of the US, farmers lost large parts of their income, and some small businesses faced uncertainty. Meanwhile, Chinese exporters also faced difficulties as their goods became more expensive for American buyers. So both sides started to feel the pain of what the media began calling the trade war.
The phrase trade war sounds dramatic, but it simply means a series of back-and-forth actions, tariffs, bans, and restrictions that countries use to pressure each other during trade disputes. There were no weapons or soldiers, but the economic effects were powerful. Prices of many products increased, companies had to adjust their supply chains, and investors around the world started worrying about the global economy slowing down because of the conflict between these two giants.
Yes, and it wasn't just about money. The trade tensions also represented a deeper question. Who would lead the global economy in the 21st century? The United States had been the world's economic leader for decades, but China was rising fast with new industries, massive infrastructure projects, and global investments like the Belt and Road Initiative. For some people in the US, China's growing influence felt like a challenge to America's traditional dominance. That added a political and strategic dimension to the trade debate.
That's a very important observation, Julia. The trade conflict wasn't just an argument over goods, it was also about technology and power. Both nations wanted to lead in areas like 5G networks, artificial intelligence, and semiconductors, the tiny computer chips that power everything from phones to cars. The competition in these fields was fierce, and both sides saw economic leadership as essential for national security and global influence. So, trade tensions were really about more than just money. They were about the future.
Exactly. And for English learners listening to us right now, this is a great example of how global issues are often connected. Words like trade, technology, and security may sound different, but in reality, they are deeply related. When countries trade, they share ideas, resources, and knowledge. But when they stop trusting each other, those connections break down. That's why diplomacy, the art of communication between countries, becomes so important. It helps prevent small disagreements from turning into major conflicts.
You're absolutely right. During the rise of trade tensions, diplomats and negotiators from both sides tried to meet, talk, and find solutions. But these meetings were often difficult because both countries wanted to protect their interests. The U.S. wanted China to buy more American products and stop what it saw as unfair trade practices. China, on the other hand, wanted the U.S. to remove tariffs and respect its right to develop its economy. Finding a balance between those goals was never easy.
Yes, and that's what makes the story so complex. On one hand, both sides knew that cooperation was necessary. They depended on each other economically. On the other hand, both wanted to appear strong and independent to their own people. So every negotiation became a test of patience, strategy, and national pride. The world was watching closely, and global markets reacted to every announcement, every speech, and every new tariff. It was a tense time for international business and politics.
And this was also a learning moment for many people around the world. Students, journalists, and even English learners started paying more attention to terms like tariffs, sanctions, imports, and exports. Many realized that understanding global trade is not just for economists, it's for everyone who wants to make sense of how the world works. This is why, here at the English Globe, we believe it's important to explain these complex ideas in simple and clear English. The more you understand, the more confident you become in global discussions.
That's so true. And dear listeners, if you're following along, think about what we've learned so far. Cooperation can bring countries together, but competition can also divide them. The US and China started as partners, but as their economies grew, their interests began to clash. The rise of trade tensions was not just a random event. It was the result of years of imbalance, misunderstanding, and changing power dynamics. These are lessons we can apply not only to world politics, but also to everyday communication and negotiation.
Beautifully said, Julia. So, as we move forward in this podcast, we'll explore what happened next, how President Trump's administration decided to intensify the trade battle, what strategies China used to respond, and how the entire world was affected by these decisions. This next chapter in the story will show how two of the most powerful leaders, Trump and Xi, tried to shape the global economy in their own way. And it will also give our English learners even more real-world vocabulary and insight into how diplomacy works.
Yes, the next part of our journey is where the story becomes even more interesting and dramatic. We'll talk about Trump's trade policy in detail, the series of tariffs and negotiations that followed, and how those choices changed the direction of international trade. So stay with us, dear listeners. And remember to like, subscribe, and share this podcast from the English Globe so that more learners can join us in exploring the world through English.
As we continue our story, dear listeners, we now enter one of the most intense and defining moments in modern economic history, the trade war between the United States and China. When Donald Trump took office in 2017, he came with a clear promise to change how America dealt with global trade. He wanted to reduce the U.S. trade deficit, bring back factory jobs, and make sure that American businesses were treated fairly on the international stage. For many voters, this was a refreshing and bold message.
Yes, Adam, and this message was built around one key idea: America first. Trump believed that previous trade deals had benefited other countries more than the US, and he wanted to reverse that trend. His administration started reviewing all trade agreements, questioning international organizations, and focusing especially on China, which he often described as the main competitor of the United States. He said that China had been taking advantage of the US for decades, and that it was time to fix that.
And his way of fixing it was through what many people called a new kind of economic battle. Trump began by using tariffs, special taxes on imported goods, as a weapon in trade negotiations. In early 2018, the U.S. government announced tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, saying it was a matter of national security. Soon after, it placed tariffs on Chinese goods worth billions of dollars, including electronics, machinery, and household products. The goal was to make Chinese products more expensive and push companies to produce more in America.
China, of course, did not stay silent. They responded quickly by imposing tariffs on American exports, especially agricultural goods like soybeans, wheat, and pork. This move targeted U.S. farmers, who relied heavily on selling their products to China. Many of these farmers lived in states that had supported Trump in the election, so this created a political and economic challenge for his administration. The trade war was not only about big companies and factories. It affected everyday workers and families.
That's a very important point, Julia. Trade wars often sound like big global strategies, but they can have real consequences for ordinary people. Prices for some goods in the U.S. began to rise because of the tariffs, and supply chains, the systems that connect production and delivery, were disrupted. American companies that depended on parts made in China suddenly faced higher costs. Some moved their production to other countries like Vietnam or Mexico, while others tried to negotiate with the government for tariff exemptions.
Exactly, and during this time, both leaders, President Trump and President Xi Jinping, tried to project strength. Trump used social media, especially Twitter, to communicate his position directly to the public. He would often write messages like, "Trade wars are good and easy to win." On the other side, Chinese state media emphasized national resilience and self-reliance. They presented China as a patient and strong country that would not be bullied by foreign pressure. The result was a communication battle that went beyond economics. It became about image and pride.
That's right, and this communication battle shaped how the world saw the two countries. Some nations supported Trump's push for fairer trade, while others worried that the tension between the U.S. and China could slow down the global economy. Major international organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, also became involved, as both sides filed complaints and accused each other of violating trade rules. The media described it as a cold economic war, because even though there were no weapons, the tension was spreading across industries.
And another part of this conflict was the technology war, especially concerning companies like Huawei. The US government placed restrictions on Chinese technology firms, saying they could pose security risks to American networks. Washington banned some Chinese companies from accessing US technologies and pressured its allies to do the same. China, in return, started developing its own technologies more aggressively, aiming to become independent from Western suppliers. This part of the trade war showed that the conflict was not just about goods. It was also about innovation and power.
Yes, and one of the biggest moments in this story came when both leaders met face-to-face at international summits, such as the G20 meetings. These moments were closely watched by the media. Trump and Xi would shake hands, smile for the cameras, and promise to continue talks. But behind those smiles, negotiations were tough and often broke down because both sides had very different goals. The U.S. wanted China to change its industrial policies, reduce state subsidies, and buy more American goods. China wanted the U.S. to lift tariffs and stop trying to control its economic model.
Many experts describe these meetings as a dance, sometimes friendly, sometimes tense, but always complicated. Both countries knew that they needed each other. The US relied on China as a major trading partner and manufacturer. China relied on the US as a huge market for its exports and as a source of advanced technology. So neither side wanted the relationship to collapse completely. But finding a balance between cooperation and competition was one of the hardest diplomatic challenges of the modern era.
Yes, and one event that showed just how difficult it was happened in 2019, when talks between the two countries suddenly broke down after months of progress. Each side blamed the other. The U.S. said that China had walked back on promises, while China said that the U.S. was demanding too much. The situation became even more uncertain, and markets around the world reacted with fear. Stock prices fell, businesses delayed investments, and everyone started asking the same question: how long would this trade war continue?
That was the big question, Adam. And while this was happening, ordinary people continued to feel the impact. Farmers in the US faced large losses and needed government support. In China, some factories slowed production or laid off workers. Consumers everywhere faced higher prices for products like phones, computers, and clothes. It was a reminder that when two powerful countries clash economically, the effects reach far beyond their borders. They affect the global economy and the lives of millions of people.
That's a very good observation, Julia. And for our English learners listening today, this period of the trade war is full of useful words to study. Terms like tariffs, imports, exports, supply chains, negotiations, and deficit. These words are part of the global vocabulary you need to understand international news. When you see them in articles or hear them in conversations, you'll now know how they connect to real-world events like the US-China trade dispute.
Absolutely. And it's also a great lesson in communication and leadership. Both Trump and Xi had to balance domestic expectations with international diplomacy. Trump wanted to show American strength and fairness. Xi wanted to protect China's image and maintain stability at home. Both faced pressure from their citizens and their industries. This constant balancing act made every negotiation unpredictable and often emotional, especially when it came to national pride.
Yes, and this combination of economic, political, and emotional factors made the trade war one of the most studied events in recent history. Universities, economists, and journalists all tried to understand what the outcome might be. Some believed that the conflict could lead to a new balance in global trade, while others feared it might create long-term damage to international cooperation. In the end, both countries realized that continuing the fight forever would hurt everyone, and that realization opened the door to new talks.
And those new talks eventually led to what became known as the Phase 1 trade deal, which we will discuss in the next section of our podcast. It was an agreement signed in early 2020 that aimed to ease the trade tensions and bring some stability back to global markets. But before we get there, it's important to remember what this era taught us: that trade is not just about money. It's about trust, communication, and the balance between national interests and global cooperation.
Perfectly said, Julia. For our listeners, understanding this story helps you not only learn about economics and politics, but also improve your English comprehension through real global examples. Remember, the goal of the English Globe is to help you see the world through language, to make complex ideas simple, and to connect learning with understanding. So, as we move to the next part, we'll explore how both sides tried to reach peace through the Phase 1 agreement, and what lessons we can learn from that process.
After months of growing trade pressure, China's leadership had to decide how to respond to President Trump's new tariffs and economic challenges. For President Xi Jinping and his government, this was not only a question of economics. It was also about national strength, reputation, and long-term vision. From the very beginning, China made it clear that it did not want a trade war, but if it was forced into one, it would defend its interests and look for ways to reduce its dependence on American markets.
That's right, Julia. And China's strategy was multi-layered and carefully planned. They didn't just react with emotion or anger. Instead, they designed a series of smart responses that combined short-term actions with long-term goals. On the surface, they answered the U.S. tariffs with counter-tariffs, meaning that they placed taxes on American goods entering China. But beneath those immediate responses, China also started adjusting its economy to become stronger and more independent in the future.
Exactly, Adam. One of the first things China did was target products that would cause political pressure in the United States. For example, they placed high tariffs on agricultural goods like soybeans, corn, and pork. These were important exports from states that strongly supported Donald Trump during his election. By doing this, China hoped to make American farmers and politicians push the U.S. government to soften its trade stance. It was a strategic move designed to create domestic pressure inside the United States.
Yes, and at the same time, China began encouraging its companies to find new markets. Instead of depending too heavily on U.S. buyers, Chinese exporters started trading more with countries in Asia, Africa, and Europe. China's trade with other regions increased, especially under the Belt and Road Initiative, which aimed to connect Chinese infrastructure and investment with countries around the world. This helped China maintain export levels even while the trade relationship with the U.S. became tense.
Another important part of China's response was its focus on technology and innovation. The trade war made Chinese leaders realize that relying too much on foreign technology, especially from the United States, was a risk. The restrictions on companies like Huawei showed how vulnerable China could be if it didn't control its own supply chains. In response, the government launched policies to develop domestic technologies, improve manufacturing quality, and produce high-end components like semiconductors at home.
That's a really key point, Julia. Many Chinese experts called this moment a wake-up call. It pushed the country to speed up what they called self-reliance in science and technology. New programs were launched to support local innovation, research, and education. Universities and technology parks received more funding. Companies were encouraged to invest in advanced fields like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and robotics. The message was clear. China wanted to make sure that no external pressure could stop its growth.
Yes. And what's fascinating is how China used a mix of calm diplomacy and national motivation. President Xi Jinping's speeches during this period often emphasized patience, unity, and self-confidence. He said that China had faced challenges before and would overcome this one too. The government's media promoted slogans like "turn crisis into opportunity" and "strength through innovation." These messages helped maintain social stability and encourage citizens to keep working hard despite the economic uncertainty caused by the trade war.
And in many ways, this attitude impressed observers around the world. While the U.S. government used strong public statements and unpredictable moves, China preferred a quieter, more methodical approach. Instead of reacting emotionally to every new tariff, they studied the impact carefully, adjusted their economy, and responded step by step. This showed that the Chinese government was thinking not just about the next few months, but about the next few decades. Their goal was long-term strength and stability.
That's right, Adam. And one of the most significant long-term strategies that emerged from this period was the idea of dual circulation. This is an economic model introduced by President Xi that focuses on two main parts: internal circulation, which strengthens domestic production and consumption, and external circulation, which continues trade with other countries. The idea is that even if the global market becomes unstable, China's economy can still grow through its own internal power, through its people, industries, and innovation.
Yes, and this strategy became even more important during the years that followed, especially when global conditions changed because of the pandemic. But even before that, it was clear that China was learning from the trade conflict. By investing in its own technological ecosystem and building relationships with other developing countries, China was preparing for a future where it could be more self-sufficient and less affected by foreign trade policies. It was a smart and forward-looking plan.
And Adam, it's important to mention that while China was strengthening itself internally, it also tried to keep the door open for dialogue. Chinese diplomats continued to meet with their American counterparts and expressed interest in finding a fair and balanced solution. They wanted to show the world that China was a responsible global player, a nation that believed in negotiation and peace, not confrontation. This balanced tone helped China maintain international support and trust during a very complex period.
That's true, Julia. And for English learners listening today, there's a lot to take away from this story. It's not just about trade, it's also about strategy, patience, and communication. China's response showed how countries can use long-term planning instead of emotional reactions. When faced with pressure, they analyzed the situation, identified their weaknesses, and turned those weaknesses into motivation for growth. This is a useful lesson not only in politics, but also in personal development and learning.
Absolutely. And from an economic perspective, China's actions had global effects. As Chinese companies began to focus more on innovation, many industries around the world started to change. For example, more nations began investing in their own manufacturing and research, fearing similar trade disruptions in the future. The trade war between the US and China showed how interconnected the global economy really is. When two giants make a move, the entire world feels the vibration.
That's so true. Global markets reacted every time new tariffs were announced or trade talks resumed. Stock exchanges in Asia, Europe, and America all watched the situation closely. For multinational companies, it became essential to diversify supply chains and reduce dependence on any single country. This shift led to new partnerships across Asia and Latin America, and it showed that globalization was not ending. It was simply evolving. The world was adjusting to a new kind of economic competition shaped by strategy and technology.
And through it all, President Xi Jinping kept emphasizing one central message. China would continue to open up to the world, but on its own terms. The government announced new reforms to attract foreign investment, simplify business regulations, and promote free trade zones. These steps were meant to show that China was still a reliable global partner, even if it disagreed with some of the US policies. This balance between self-reliance and openness became a key theme in China's long-term economic philosophy.
Exactly, Julia. And this philosophy helped China stabilize its economy despite the trade war's challenges. While growth slowed slightly, it remained strong compared to most other countries. The Chinese currency stayed relatively stable, and many industries continued expanding. The world began to see that China was not just reacting to short-term problems, it was building a foundation for future strength. And that's why this period is so important for students of international relations and global economics to study.
Yes, Adam, and for our English learners, there's another lesson here: the importance of resilience. China's response teaches us that when faced with challenges, the best approach is to stay calm, analyze carefully, and work toward self-improvement. Instead of focusing on conflict, focus on growth. Instead of fear, focus on preparation. These values can be applied to learning English too. Progress takes patience, strategy, and confidence, just like building a strong economy does.
That's beautifully said, Julia. And to summarize this section, we can say that China's response to the trade war was both defensive and creative. They protected their industries through counter-tariffs, developed new technologies to reduce dependence, and built a long-term plan to make their economy more balanced and independent. Their approach influenced not only their relationship with the U.S., but also the global economy as a whole. It was a turning point in modern trade history, and a valuable case study for all of us.
Exactly. And in the next part of our podcast, dear listeners, we'll explore how these strategies led to the Phase 1 trade agreement, the deal that tried to bring temporary peace between the US and China after years of tension. We'll discuss what was agreed upon, what challenges remained, and how the world reacted to this moment of cautious optimism. So stay tuned to the English Globe, where we continue to bring you global knowledge through clear and simple English.
Now that we've explored how both the United States and China responded during the trade conflict, it's time to look at the bigger picture, how these trade tensions affected the global economy. Because when the two largest economies in the world start challenging each other, the impact doesn't stop at their borders. It spreads across continents, industries, and people's daily lives. This was not just a story of politics and diplomacy, it was a story that reached into homes, workplaces, and wallets around the world.
That's so true, Adam. When tariffs began rising between the US and China, the first effect was on prices. Tariffs made many goods more expensive because they added an extra cost to imported products. For example, if an American company had to pay more to bring in Chinese-made electronics or machinery, those extra costs often got passed on to consumers. Suddenly, products like washing machines, smartphones, and even simple household tools became more expensive in US stores. This caused frustration among buyers who were already dealing with a competitive economy.
Yes, and the same thing happened in China too. Chinese consumers faced higher prices for certain American products, such as food, luxury items, and vehicles. American companies like Apple and General Motors felt the pressure, because selling their products in China became harder. Many multinational companies that depended on smooth trade between the two countries suddenly had to rethink their plans. They started moving some of their factories to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico to avoid tariffs and reduce risk. This process is what economists call supply chain diversification.
That's right, Adam. And for English learners listening today, supply chain simply means the system of making and delivering products, from raw materials to the finished goods we buy in stores. When trade tensions disrupted this chain, factories in both countries were affected. Some American manufacturers that depended on Chinese parts had to find new suppliers, and some Chinese factories lost orders from US companies. In both cases, workers faced uncertainty. Some lost jobs while others had to adapt to new industries or technologies.
And it wasn't only about factories. Farmers also felt the consequences deeply. When China placed tariffs on American soybeans, corn, and pork, many U.S. farmers suddenly lost one of their biggest buyers. For decades, China had been a major market for American agriculture. The trade war changed that. Warehouses filled up with unsold crops, and prices for agricultural goods dropped. The U.S. government had to provide billions of dollars in support to help struggling farmers. It was a clear reminder that global politics can directly affect local communities.
Yes, and on the other side, Chinese industries had their own challenges too. Some factories that relied on American technology, like semiconductor chips and software, found it difficult to continue production smoothly. To solve this, China began investing more in domestic innovation and local suppliers. This created new opportunities for Chinese engineers, researchers, and startups, but it also took time and effort. The process of building self-reliance was not easy, and in the short term, it created economic stress for many businesses.
And during this time, global markets became very sensitive to every piece of news about U.S.-China relations. When leaders from both sides met or made positive comments, stock markets around the world went up. When new tariffs were announced or talks broke down, markets went down. This constant movement made investors nervous, and companies had to plan carefully. For international businesses, stability is extremely important. When two powerful economies fight, it creates uncertainty that affects investment, trade, and even employment across the globe.
Exactly. And it's important for our listeners to understand that trade is not just a political issue. It's a part of everyday life. Every product we buy, from phones and clothes to food and furniture, is connected to global trade in some way. When tariffs or restrictions change, prices and availability also change. So even if you live far from the United States or China, you might still feel the effects of their trade policies through the prices in your local market or the brands that appear in your stores.
That's a great point, Julia. Let's take an example. Imagine a student living in Africa or South America who wants to buy a smartphone. If the components of that phone come from both China and the United States, then the trade war can increase the production costs. The final price might rise, even though the student lives thousands of miles away. This shows how connected the modern world is. One policy decision in Washington or Beijing can affect people on every continent.
Yes, and this global connection made many countries rethink their own economic policies. Nations in Europe, Southeast Asia, and Africa started asking themselves how they could protect their economies from future trade shocks. Some began signing new trade agreements to reduce dependence on any one country. Others increased their local production of goods. The trade war between the US and China became a lesson for everyone. That global cooperation is essential, but it also requires balance and preparedness.
And while all of this was happening, international organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, were watching closely. Economists warned that prolonged trade tensions could slow global economic growth. They encouraged both sides to negotiate, emphasizing that global prosperity depends on open trade. After all, when large economies struggle, smaller ones often suffer more. The situation showed that cooperation, not confrontation, is the key to long-term global stability.
That's absolutely true. And another interesting effect of the trade war was how it changed business strategies. Many companies began to rely more on automation and technology to reduce costs. Others started exploring new markets in countries with growing populations and emerging economies. This period pushed global companies to become more flexible and innovative. In some ways, the trade war acted like a test. It revealed which businesses were prepared to adapt and which ones depended too heavily on a single market or supplier.
Yes, and from an educational point of view, this is an excellent example of how global economics works in real life. For English learners, it shows how words like tariffs, markets, exports, imports, supply chains, and inflation are not just vocabulary, they represent real forces that shape the world we live in. Understanding them helps you read international news, watch global events with more confidence, and talk intelligently about important topics in English.
And beyond the economics, there's also a human story. Millions of workers, business owners, and families around the world experienced change during this time. Some lost jobs, others found new opportunities. Some countries benefited by becoming alternative manufacturing hubs, while others suffered from falling exports. This is why studying trade relations is so important. It helps us see that behind every headline or policy, there are people whose lives are directly affected.
Yes, and one of the biggest lessons of this period was that interdependence, the way countries rely on each other, is both a strength and a weakness. When trade flows smoothly, everyone benefits. But when trade breaks down, everyone feels the pain. This is why international cooperation is so essential. The trade war reminded the world that no country, no matter how big or powerful, can stand completely alone in the modern economy.
Beautifully said, Adam. And for our dear listeners, this idea also connects to your own learning journey. Just like countries depend on each other, we all depend on communication and understanding to grow. Learning English helps you become part of this global conversation. It allows you to read the news, understand different perspectives, and share your voice on international issues like trade, politics, and technology. That's why learning English is not just about language, it's about connection.
Exactly, Julia. So as we've seen, the trade tensions between the US and China changed not only global economics, but also how the world thinks about cooperation and independence. Prices changed, companies moved, and people adapted. It was a challenging time, but it also encouraged creativity and innovation. And for English learners, it provided an incredible opportunity to study global communication through real events. When we understand the world, we become better global citizens.
Perfectly summarized, Adam. And in the next part of our podcast, we'll move into one of the most hopeful moments of this story, the Phase 1 trade agreement. We'll explore what both sides agreed upon, what changes it brought, and why it was seen as a sign of temporary peace after years of tension. So stay tuned to the English Globe, dear listeners. And don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us from which country you are listening and what you think about global trade.
Yes, we always love hearing from you. Remember, every comment you leave helps us understand your learning needs and makes this global community stronger. So, wherever you are, in Asia, Africa, Europe, or the Americas, you are part of the English Globe family. Thank you for joining us today, and let's continue this fascinating journey in the next section. After years of tension, tariffs, and uncertainty, there finally came a time when both the United States and China started to look for peace. Business communities around the world were tired of the ongoing conflict, global markets were unstable, and ordinary people were feeling the pressure of rising prices. It became clear that continuing the trade war would hurt both sides. That's when talks began for what the world would later call the Phase 1 deal.
Yes, Adam. The Phase 1 deal was an attempt to cool down the trade tensions between President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping. It was not a full solution to all the problems, but rather a first step, a beginning to build trust again. Negotiators from both countries met several times, sometimes in Washington and sometimes in Beijing, to discuss how they could balance their interests. These meetings were intense and complicated because trade between the US and China is deeply connected and involves billions of dollars every year.
That's right, Julia. The two countries had many issues to solve. The United States wanted China to buy more American products, especially agricultural goods like soybeans, pork, and corn. American farmers had suffered during the trade war, so this was a top priority for President Trump. The U.S. also wanted stronger protections for intellectual property, meaning the rights of companies to protect their ideas, inventions, and technology. Many American businesses had complained that their technologies were being copied or shared unfairly in China.
Exactly. And on the other side, China wanted something equally important, the removal or reduction of tariffs that were hurting its exports. Chinese companies were facing difficulties selling their products to the American market because of high import taxes. China also wanted to make sure that any agreement respected its right to develop its economy independently. For China, the negotiations were about finding a fair balance, cooperation without losing control of its national goals.
After months of discussions, and even a few public disagreements, the two sides finally reached an agreement in January 2020. This was known as the Phase 1 trade deal. It was signed in Washington, D.C., in a ceremony that brought together U.S. and Chinese officials. Both sides presented it as a victory, a sign of hope that trade peace was possible. But behind the smiles and handshakes, the deal was only a temporary step, not a final resolution.
Let's talk a bit about what this agreement actually included. Under the deal, China agreed to purchase an additional $200 billion worth of U.S. goods and services over 2 years. This included farm products, manufactured goods, energy, and services like finance and tourism. The goal was to reduce the trade imbalance between the two nations. In return, the United States agreed to reduce some tariffs on Chinese goods, though many remained in place. It was a compromise. Each side gave something and kept something.
That's a great summary, Julia. Another important part of the deal was about technology and intellectual property rights. China promised to strengthen its laws to protect the rights of foreign companies. It also agreed to avoid forcing technology transfers, something that had been a major complaint from American businesses. This part of the deal was about trust and fairness. Both sides wanted to show that they could compete in a healthy and respectful way.
Yes, and for English learners listening today, this was also a big lesson in diplomacy. Diplomacy means solving problems through talks, respect, and understanding, not through conflict or aggression. When we read about leaders meeting, shaking hands, or signing agreements, we are actually seeing diplomacy in action. It's the art of communication between nations. In this case, both President Trump and President Xi showed that even during difficult times, dialogue is always possible.
That's so true, Julia. And the process itself was fascinating. The negotiators from both countries had to deal with cultural differences, political pressures, and economic expectations. Communication was not always easy. Sometimes statements from one side were misunderstood by the other. This shows how important language and clear communication are in international relations. The very reason why learning English is such a powerful skill for our listeners. English often becomes the bridge language in these global meetings.
Exactly, Adam. And even though the deal was signed, challenges still remained. Many analysts said that the targets for Chinese purchases were too high and unrealistic. Then, not long after the signing, the world was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which disrupted global trade again. As factories shut down and international travel stopped, both sides struggled to meet their promises. The situation showed that while political agreements are important, real-world events can change everything.
Yes, and beyond the economic impact, there were still deeper issues that the Phase 1 deal didn't solve. Things like technology competition, human rights concerns, and geopolitical rivalries. Those topics required long-term dialogue and mutual trust, not just numbers or contracts. But even so, the deal was a symbolic victory. It reminded the world that cooperation is always better than confrontation.
That's beautifully said, Adam. For many people around the world, the image of American and Chinese leaders shaking hands gave hope. It showed that no matter how big the conflict, there's always space for understanding and compromise. The world learned that progress doesn't always come from winning. Sometimes, it comes from listening. The Phase 1 deal may have been small, but it was a moment of peace in a long and complex story.
Yes, and that's something we all can learn from, both in politics and in life. Communication is the key. Whether it's between countries, companies, or individuals, talking and listening help build trust. And for our English learners, remember, when you learn English, you are learning the language of global diplomacy. You are learning how to connect, how to share ideas, and how to be part of international discussions like these.
Exactly. And that's why we, here at the English Globe, bring you these kinds of stories to help you improve your English while understanding how our world works. The US-China trade talks were not just about business. They were about dialogue, patience, and finding common ground.
So, dear listeners, as we wrap up this section, we invite you to think about this question. How can communication solve conflicts in your own life or community? Let us know in the comments below where you're listening from and what you've learned today. Don't forget to like this podcast and subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode.
Yes, we love reading your thoughts and seeing how you connect to these global stories. In the next section, we'll explore what happened after the deal, how the world reacted, and what lessons English learners can take from this experience. Stay tuned and keep learning with the English Globe. As we wrap up today's episode, we can see that US-China trade relations are about more than economics. They show us how countries communicate, solve problems, and plan for the future. Dialogue, patience, and understanding are as important in global affairs as they are in our everyday lives.
Exactly, Julia. For English learners, this story also teaches a valuable lesson. Learning a language helps you connect with the world, understand new ideas, and participate in important conversations. By studying global events, we practice English while becoming better global citizens.
Thank you for listening, dear friends. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Keep learning, stay curious, and remember, understanding and communication are the keys to a better future.